Welcome to the Church Renewal Podcast from Flourish Coaching. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Matt.
Today, Matt and I will talk about how to assess the health of your church. The first step that Flourish coaches lead a church through is the church health assessment. This is a crucial stage of investigation and intentional critique of the church's past and present, designed to allow your church to identify areas of weakness and build confidently in the place where God has planted you. Welcome back to the Church Renewal Podcast. I'm sitting here with Matthew Bowling from Flourish Coaching.
Hey, Jer. How are you?
I'm good. We're still talking about why people are using or should be considering using transitional pastors. You talked about the questions that are being asked in the church health assessment. What are those questions? And let's talk about them.
Yeah, so in that first phase of church health assessment, so 3 phases: church health assessment, envisioning pastor search, that's in our transition process. In church health assessment, we're trying to answer 2 questions. Where have we been and where are we?
Okay. So talk about the overview, the goal, and the church health assessment.
Sure.
What are we after?
Yeah, so in the church health assessment, think again about going to the doctor, right? You go in, they measure your weight, your height, take your blood pressure, they do your labs, right? They're trying to give you an overall picture sort of your health. Mm-hmm. And the kind of doctor sort of looks you over and he goes, you got a big, if he's looking at me, he's like, you got a big scar in your right lower leg. Was that an Achilles tendon rupture? Yep. Yeah, it was my first Father's Day. It was pretty bad. You got a nasty scar in your elbow. What was that about? Yeah, I was in a car accident and had to have surgery to move my ulnar nerve around, right? Your knee looks a little swollen. What was going on there? Yeah, I had to have 2 surgeries there. The history of a person, they always ask you your medical history, right? When you get started up with a new doctor, because your history and your present are both important. And so that's what we're trying to look at in church health assessment. Where have we been, which is the question of history? Where are we, which is the question of current health?
You're basically saying it's necessary to stop, turn around, and look backwards intentionally with eyes wide open in order to successfully move forward.
And here's the reason why. You are where you are right now as a church for very good and understandable reasons. Best to understand what those are. And most churches are not cognizant of what got them to where they are right now. We can tell them about where they are, but unless we help them look at their history thoughtfully, we can't help them figure out, well, what got us here? Because that's an implicit question, right? Mm-hmm. Where have you been? The question of history. Where are you now? Your question of present. And there's an implicit question to be like, well, how did we get here? And how we got here is really, really important, because if what got us here contributed to us being unhealthy, then those are the kinds of things that we had to work on in the transitional period so that they're washed out of the system or washed through the system
right.
by the time we actually get to a new pastor. So he inherits a church that's thoughtful, that's reflective about its history, right? I've had 2 arthroscopic knee surgeries on my left knee. You know what? When I go play racquetball, I wear a brace. Why? I'm cognizant of my history.
And it looks so cool.
I'm not sure it looks cool.
Everybody knows the guy wearing the knee brace is serious about racquetball.
But it's me cognizant of my history, right? But also, I'm there playing racquetball because I want to be healthy moving forward, cognizant of my history. So it's both.
Okay, so what are some of the surprising discoveries that you've seen churches make that they were not expecting that helped them to move forward?
Yeah.
Without violating HIPAA.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Church HIPAA, whatever that would be. CHIPAA, maybe. Oh, boy. Okay, so maybe a couple examples. We worked with a church several years ago where the founding pastor left. Just before he left, he had brought in a guy on staff who was there to be the next church plant. And the church planter who had been there, an offer came along to him that he wasn't expecting. And he and his wife prayed about it. And they're like, you know what? We think this is what God wants us to go do. And we're as surprised as you all are. Because they were. Yeah. Because they just brought this guy in to be an assistant pastor and then send him out to plant a church. And so the guy and his wife end up leaving and he goes into another job. And now you have this assistant pastor that's kind of wandering in space. And so eventually that church comes around and they end up hiring that assistant pastor to be the lead pastor of that church instead of going to plant one.
Okay.
And that pastor ends up having a really hard time. And he ends up leaving after a period of time. And the church hired us in the aftermath of that. And they were having a hard time trying to just get any traction to look forward at all. And we're like, well, let us try and understand your history here. So when we did, we discovered these things, and we discovered that the assistant pastor is quite different than the founding pastor. Not atypical, right? We also found out that the elders in this particular church, as they tried to deal with the aftermath of both of those pastors leaving, had said very little to the congregation.
Okay.
And that had left the congregation very unsettled. And so we had to come along and say, okay, well, the reason you're having a hard time going forward is because of the way that these transitions were handled. And you're going to need to kind of finish them in order to go forward as a church. And we did help them finish them so that they could go forward as a church.
That touches on my follow-up question to this is, and maybe you can flesh that out more, that maybe there's a different example.
Yeah.
How have churches, as they've come to these discoveries, as they've done the analysis and realized something that they hadn't necessarily seen before, how have they used these insights to make a change, make a turn? And the second part of that is, how painful has that process been?
I think that how painful is, it depends. Sometimes it's a relief for the congregation. Like the church I was just talking about, it was a relief for that congregation, for their elders to stand up in front of them and say, we didn't say enough about this. Flourish has helped us see that, and they've helped us think through what we can share, and we're going to share more with you about that particular circumstance, actually about both of these, as I recall it. And it helped the congregation take a breath, get settled, and be willing to be led forward. And I think that that ultimately is the role of elders, right? Is to try and help lead a congregation forward. So that particular instance, it was super, super helpful for them to do that. And so I think that what we try and do, the way we try and understand our role, is we are there to try and equip the elders of the church to lead the church forward. So if they can help a church go, we messed this up in the past. So there's a circumstance right now with the church that we're helping right now that we're trying to help them grapple with, where there was a difficult circumstance that happened about 10 years ago, and it never got resolved in the minds of congregants. As we've worked with the leadership, we have found that the leadership has resolved it among themselves, but they never did that out loud for the sake of others.
Just sort of let sleeping dogs lie?
Exactly.
Yeah, that never works out well.
And we're coming to them and saying, no, from the work that we've done in our church health assessment, this is still very live, even though you thought it was resolved. And in our advice to them, we basically said, hey, what you've been willing to say to us, if you can find a way to say this out loud to the congregation, we think this thing could be put to bed. And it would be really good if it was.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. Have you found that in the churches where elders are able to walk in that humility of saying, we messed up, we made a mistake, it was ours, we're sorry, here's what we're going to do to change this, and we're not asking you to trust us, but to extend us grace as we follow Jesus, and we're asking you to follow him. What benefits have you seen come from that?
Yeah, I think that you gain trust with congregants. They already know. Congregants already know that you messed up. When you come and you tell them that you messed up, they're like, oh, good, finally. Yeah, you're admitting what we already knew was true. And that actually helps you gain credibility. It also lets you model that you own the gospel yourselves, because the gospel gives us the freedom and the space to say, first of all, I'm a frail, weak, limited creature, and so I must make mistakes all of the time that come with just being a creature because of limitations of being a creature, and I'm a sinner. And so I make mistakes all of the time, and the gospel gives us the freedom to not have to be perfect, but to be people who are very flawed. I marvel that God uses as crooked a stick as me to strike straight lines. That's an old line, but that's all of us.
Oh, I thought your wife wrote that for you.
That's actually really good. Julianne would completely say that. She would marvel, actually. And I think the gospel gives us the freedom to receive our limitations that we have as creatures, that gives us all kinds of frailty and all kinds of faults and mistakes that aren't sinful, They just come with being a creature, right? And then on top of that, we're also sinners.
Mm-hmm.
And so the gospel gives us the space to admit how small we are and how frail we are, and that's actually okay. And that gains us credibility in the eyes of maturing Christians. Now, of people that are judgmental or want to find fault or want to exercise control themselves, no. But we're trying to model what it looks like to believe and live out the implications of the gospel to people, and that's always worth leading in that way.
The words of Paul definitely come to mind as you say that. In my weakness, he is proven strong.
Absolutely.
I could dive down into a rabbit hole here. I won't, because this isn't my podcast. So let me ask you this. Is there a book or resource along these lines, not just looking backwards for the assessment, but of really leaning into gospel-centered grace as a leadership that you could recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll link in the show notes. Hopefully I'll get the title right when I say it here into the microphone. But in just the most recent years, Scott Thomas, who had experiences, very difficult experiences actually, at a couple of churches that blew up, Marcel in Seattle and the Journey in St. Louis. So
nothing bad happened there?
Nothing bad at either one of those places. But he worked on the staffs of both of those churches and could see the things that were wrong and kind of walked out of those experiences forlorn as to could the gospel really make a difference in the lives of these really strong leaders. And eventually he ended up working with Ray Ortland in Nashville at his church, running into the church just as a congregant, and eventually thankfully he wrote, I think it's called The Gospel-Centered Leader.
Okay.
And if that's not the title, we'll correct it. But it'll be the right thing. Will be in the show notes. But it's marvelous, and it's what I most highly recommend for leaders to think through. How do we understand and own the gospel for ourselves, and then lead in light of it? And it is my go-to. It's one of those books that I'm so glad that he wrote it, so that I don't have to, because it was a big hole in the literature that was out there.
Amen. Amen to that. Okay, turning the corner. How does a church know when they have answered the question, where are we now?
When they can articulate, understand, and own their history and how it's contributed to the present.
Okay.
And here's the reason here's the reason why that's important. You are doomed as a church to repeat the past in the future if you do not wrestle with the past in the present.
Okay. Go ahead and say that again 3 times fast.
As a church, you are doomed to repeat the past in the future if you do not wrestle with the past in the present. That's why we want you to wrestle with the past and how it's contributed to the present so the future might be different.
I'm comfortable with silence, and I think that sitting with that reality is really useful because it makes me think of the children of Israel wandering through the wilderness. How many times are we going to? I was walking through this with my kids the other day. We were talking about Jesus in Matthew 25 saying the kingdom of heaven is like virgins that were preparing for the wedding feast, and we talked about their lack of preparation to wait for the time necessary, and we reflected back onto the children of Israel while Moses was up on Mount Sinai in Exodus 32, receiving the 10 Commandments, and the way that they come to Aaron and say, this guy Moses who led us out of Israel, we don't know what's happened to him. So, make us a God.
They got impatient.
They did have a vision. That lack of awareness of saying, yes, he led us out of Israel, but, we don't
know where this guy is now.
Maybe there's a different God. Maybe you can throw our gold into this furnace and maybe something will pop out. And
you make us a God.
Kind of leads to bad things. And then you end up wandering through the wilderness over and over and over again. I mean, going around Robin Hood's barn, walking around the mountain. My mother-in-law is really good about reminding me as her son-in-law, thank you, Janet, that until we learn what God is calling us to learn, he's going to put us back into the same situation. And it's his grace. That's his love that does that. That's not just his furrowed brow father saying, no, get it right, do it again. That's him saying, I'm refining you. Like gold, refined in the fire 7 times. Yeah, it's going to get hot, because that's what gold needs in order to remove the dross. And I'm making something out of you that looks more like Jesus than Jeremy. And I have the pleasure, I have the privilege, I have the joy of surrendering to that and saying, darn it, okay, go ahead, I'm ready, maybe. And I'll say, please forgive me to everyone around me, maybe once you get through this next step. Well, so we can articulate in the present where we are, why Jesus has called us here. Practical question.
Sure.
What tools, what paradigms do you use, can churches use to start answering those questions?
Yeah, so this is part of the process that we give them. So part of the beginning of the church health assessment process is that we ask a church historian, and we ask it in a couple of different ways. Basically, give us the history of the church. We ask it statistically, we ask it narratively. I did it with the church last night. I'll just go into a meeting and I'll just say, so tell me the story of this church. And it's fascinating when you start asking that question of 5 different people, what different stories you hear and what different perspectives you hear about the one reality of the history of that church from the Lord's perspective. We also do this later in the church health assessment process where we interview people later on in the process, because very commonly we hear about their experiences in the history of the church that they bring up on their own more indirectly. And that helps us get an overall kind of composite picture of the history of the church.
Do you find in general that most churches are open to doing that kind of introspection?
I think it's a big it depends. I think that if they are humbled in the present and they're saying, we really got to work on things here before we go for another pastor because we've had a hard history. Those churches, yes. The churches that don't want to look back are the ones that don't really want to deal with their pain. They just want to shove it under the carpet and never talk about it again and assume that it can just be better without reflecting on it. And those are the churches that typically don't end up hiring us, to be honest with you, because they just want to go forward without reflecting on the past. But unfortunately, that's very sad because they're doomed to repeat the past.
Yeah, I can't make jokes about that because I've watched it happen.
Yeah.
And tragic is probably too heavy a word to use, but it's deeply saddening.
Yeah.
Because there's so much possible when a believer or when a church leadership or when a congregation is willing to put themselves into the hand of their loving Father and receive the discipline that absolutely is unpleasant for the season.
Right.
But is being given in love. That requires humility, but that also requires a deepening trust in the grace that we've received that the writer to Hebrews talks about when he says we can approach the throne boldly to receive grace in time of need and help.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, when you get to be our ages, if you don't recognize you need help, maybe invest in mirrors.
Yeah.
A lot of them. Talk to your wife or your kids, or the driver next to you on the road who's honking at you. It's not to say hi.
Right.
Just saying. All right. Well, let's leave it there for now.
Sounds good.
We'll come back and hit this later. Thank you all for coming by. We'll be talking to you very soon. Thanks for listening to the Church Renewal Podcast from Flourish Coaching. Flourish exists to set ministry leaders free to be effective wherever God has called them. We believe that there's only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned. Jesus is still gathering his people, and he's using his church to do it. When pastors or churches feel stuck, our team of coaches refresh their hope in the gospel and help them clarify their strategy. If you have questions or a need, we'd love to hear from you. You can find us at flourishcoaching.org, and you can reach us by email at info@flourishcoaching.org. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and we would love it if you would like, subscribe, rate, or review the podcast wherever you're listening. Please share this podcast with anyone you think it'll help, and if we get a client because of a recommendation you make, we'll send you a small gift just to say thanks. And a special thanks to Bay Ridge Christian Church in Annapolis, Maryland for the use of their building to record today's episode. All music for this show has been licensed and was composed and created by artists. The Church Renewal Podcast was produced by me, Jeremy Seferati, in association with Flourish Coaching, with the goal of equipping and encouraging your church to flourish wherever God has called you.